The Mesopotamian civilization, which existed around 4000 BC, were the first to keep written records of their observations, which were mostly lost or destroyed. The records were inscribed on stone tablets detailing the movement of the sun, moon, and constellations.
The ancient Egyptians established a calendar that used the position of the stars and the rising and setting of the sun during the summer solstice. Some of their temples, such as the pyramids, aligned with the stars overhead almost perfectly.
The graphical landmark Stonehenge, which might have been used between 3000 BC to 2500 BC, was built using sophisticated techniques so that the pillars align with overhead stars to theoretically make a calendar or a sacred shrine.
The ancient Chinese civilization existed around 220 BC. They created the zodiac signs based off of the position of the moon, the year, and the month. These are called the Shai Chen and are still relevant in some cultures in today's society.
Thales was a merchant who lived between 624 and 547 BC and found out how to find the distance of a ship that was out to sea. He also discovered how to find the height of a pyramid using only its shadow. Thales also opposed the idea that Earth was flat, but instead stated that it was a cylinder.
Pythagoras was a mathematician and an astronomer who lived between 582 BC to 500 BC. He rejected the idea that the Earth was flat and stated it was a circle instead. He then found the sides of a right triangle and created the Pythagorean theorem. The Babylonians, who existed around 586 BC, paved the way for the Greek and Roman astrology to excel in discovering the mysteries of our solar system and universe.
Aristotle was a Greek astronomer who lived between 384 BC and 322 BC. He observed and recorded the moon's phases as well as supported the idea that the solar system revolved around the Earth.
Aristarchus, who lived between 310 BC and 230 BC, theorized that the sun was at the center of the solar system instead of orbiting the Earth. After this, he figured out that the stars were just like the sun. Living between 276 BC and 194 BC, Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth, the distance from the Earth to the Sun, and created prime numbers. He calculated the planet's size by observing the movement of the Sun across the sky and the shadows created by it. Hipparchus, who lived between 190 BC and 120 BC, is considered the greatest ancient astronomical observer. He is also considered the father of trigonometry.
Ptolemy was an ancient astronomer and geographer who lived between 100 AD and 170 AD. He wrote the Almagest, which talked about his ideas about celestial bodies. Ptolemy argued that the Earth was the center of everything while the sun and the planets revolved around it. He also recorded the longitude and latitudes of the world map, giving us a more detailed map.
The Mayans, along with other Mesoamericans, built their buildings and temples to correspond with the sunrise and sunset during an equinox and with Venus. The Mesoamericans even went as far as to time battles and sacred events with position of Venus. Since they worshipped it thinking it was a divine being, they also kept records about Venus to create a line of sight and records on eclipse. This also happened around 16 AD and 1016 AD. Islamic astronomers who lived between 476 AD and 15,000 AD based their research off of a Greek and Roman astronomy. They took their ancient data, enhanced it by building models, and gathered more data. They did this by building observatories, clocks, libraries to record and keep their observations. Their goals was to correct and verify ancient astronomers rather than discovering new things. Doing this kept the idea of astronomy alive and its bias that Christian Europe was used.
Copernicus was the first astronomer to develop the heliocentric model of the solar system. He also translated ancient books from the Greeks and Romans and wrote books about economics, trigonometry, and astronomy. He also wrote down his theory about a heliocentric solar system, which was read and accepted by George Ridicus, who persuaded him to publish it. All of this happened between 1473 and 1543, when the Earth was still accepted to be at the center of everything. Brahe was a well-known and respected astronomer who lived between 1546 and 1601. He rejected the idea of a heliocentric solar system and, as a result, it wasn't accepted right away. The book that made him well-known detailed his observations about a nova that appeared the year before. This made him valuable to the King of Denmark, King Frederick II, and an observatory was built for Brahe so that he could further his research. Since the observatory used metal tools, his data was extremely accurate. Galileo is considered one of the fathers of modern science because of his contributions to further knowledge in physics, astronomy, and mathematics. To do this, he needed to improve the telescope to record observations on the moon's surface, Jupiter's moons, sunspots, and phases of Venus. Then the church stepped in to stop him and lived the rest of his life under house arrest.
Kepler was put in charge of figuring out Mars' orbit by going off of his colleagues' data. He ran into a problem where it was impossible to match the data he was given because he used circles for planetary orbits. Noticing this, Kepler used an oval for the orbit and matched the data almost perfectly. After he found Mars' orbit, he established Kepler's laws of planetary motion.
Newton lived between 1643 and 1727 is considered one of the fathers of modern science. He made discoveries in optics, universal gravitation, and invented differential and integral calculus. Then he took his discoveries and wrote the Principia, which is considered to be one of his greatest scientific books ever written. This led to him creating Newton's laws of motion, which are the laws of inertia, laws of force, and laws of action and reaction.
Since the northern stars were being studied by other scientists, Halley wanted to map the southern stars, so he sailed to St. Helena. While there, he recorded the positions of 340 white stars as well as Mercury's transit across the sun. Halley is also responsible for persuading Newton to publish the book Principia. Then he went to the observe comets to publish a book on his findings. While doing this research, he discovered Halley's Comet when it kept passing by Earth. Einstein, who lived between 1897 and 1955, wrote 4 articles involving the photoelectric effect, atoms in space and time. After the articles were published, Einstein went on to create one of the most known equations, E equals mc squared. Then he published the general theory of relativity.
Niels Bohr started his scientific career by entering a science fair and studying surface tension. Then, after the contest was over, he further developed Rutherford's theory of an atom by looking at the spectrum of light was created by hydrogen. As a result, he created a new theory of how the atom looked. Wolfgang Pauli won a Nobel Peace Prize for discovering the Pauli extension principle. This principle states that no 2 electrons in an atom can occupy the same quantum state at the same time. Due to his discovery, knowledge about quantum mechanics was expanded. He also hypothesized the existence of neutrons, and through extensive research about the quantum field, the spin stasis theorem was created in 1940.
Werner Heisenberg, a German scientist, studied under Niels Bohr while at university. He is known for his theories about quantum mechanics and gave speeches about physics after his capture at the end of World War II.
Edwin Hubble was an astronomer in the 1920s who was responsible for the discovery of the Andromeda galaxy. He did this by focusing a Hooker telescope on a faint and fuzzy star cluster. Upon closer observation, he found it contained stars just like ours and determined that it wasn't a nebula but instead a galaxy. He went on to observe hundreds of other galaxies and created a classifying system for the galaxies. After that, he watched other galaxies move farther away and concluded that the universe expands uniformly. In 1990, the Hubble telescope was named after him, and it currently studies the Hubble constant.
George Lemaitre theorized about the Big Bang and discovering some solutions to Einstein's equations in relativity. These solutions hypothesized an expanding universe instead of a static one. This led to Lemaitre creating the first part of the Hubble law, which talked about expanding universe. Hubble then proved Lemaitre's theory about expanding universe by connecting light and distance. In the 1930s, he explained his theory on the Big Bangs and why it might have happened. He retired and went to help the development of the computer until he died in 1966.
Robert Oppenheimer was a physicist who was the director of the Manhattan Project during World War II. He is considered the father of the atomic bomb and advocated for nuclear disarmament after the bombings of Japan. He served on the General Advisory Committee of the Atomic Energy Commission until his death in 1967.
Fred Hoyle lived between 1950 and 2001. He went against many theories such as the Big Bang or how life began on Earth. He did, however, contribute to the theory of stellar nucleosynthesis. He also offered to be part of a team that developed atomic bomb, but refused. Instead, he worked on radar. Then he looked at building an atomic bomb and theorized how nuclear fusion could play an important role in the structure of stars. This led to him hypothesizing that stars, through nuclear reactions, can turn light elements into heavier elements to release energy.
Penzos and Wilson, these two physicists set out to map signals from the Milky Way. Instead, they discovered cosmic microwave background radiation in 1964. Due to this discovery, strong evidence of the Big Bang could be put together to support the theory even more.
Buzz Aldrin was an engineer and was on the Gemini 12 spacecraft, where he spent 4.5 days in space in 1966. Then, in 1969, he served with Neil Armstrong as a pilot on the Apollo 11 mission and was the second person to step on the moon. Neil Armstrong, who lived between 1930 and 2012, served as a naval aviator until the early 1950s to join the NACA. Then he was on the Gemini 8 missions in 1966, where he performed the first successful docking in space. After that, he served as commander of the Apollo 11 mission and was the first person to step foot on the moon.